I was part of a team at the University of Calgary that actually worked on the oil sands in the Athabasca region of Alberta, looking at how do you reclaim and restore those kinds of environments after you extracted oil. And I find it amazing that, so that was in the late 70s, early 80s. 30 years later, we're still talking about the oil sands and the oil sands pipeline and dealing with all that. So from there, I went down to New Mexico State for my PhD, and I was part, if you're familiar with this, I was part of the team that helped develop the Coronado Long-Term Ecological Research Site that was in Las Cruces at the time. And again, that was inventory and monitoring of how arid systems function. Did a postdoc for about 3 years, went to the University of, went to Texas Tech, got my first faculty position there, and have stayed there. It's been great. But one of the other parts of the story about inventory and monitoring is that, and this is something that I think you as early career people should take to account too. It's important to go to regional meetings that you might not find useful at the outset, but you don't know who you're going to run into or who's going to hear you speak about something that's going to start a collaboration that's going to be with you the rest of your life. So back in the early 90s, I had gone to a regional meeting in Texas. Actually, it was the Texas Academy of Science, just to talk, get used to talking to groups. And I gave a talk on the functioning of arid ecosystems. And what I did not know at the time was the person who was there listening was the chief scientist at Big Bend National Park. And he came up to me afterward and he said, how would you like to get involved in putting together collaboration on small referenced watersheds? And I said, well, I don't work on watersheds, I work on soils. He said, would you lead the team? I had no idea. So, but I said yes. So I got a group of people at Texas Tech. I said, this guy's coming up from Big Bend, we're going to talk. Some of it's USGS funded. And so the group from Texas Tech, about 3 or 4 of us out of biology, we met with them. And afterward, I said to my colleagues, what do you think? And they looked at me and they said, we're not interested. And I said, are you crazy? And they said, no, we're not interested. So I said, well, I'm going to do it. I've been to Big Bend now for 22 years. And I've been funded from the National Park Service and USGS for most of those 22 years because I took the chance of saying yes to the chief scientist at Big Bend. What I started my work out at Big Bend was part of what's called the Small Reference Watershed. And this was a group of scientists out of the National Park Service, USGS, that back in the early 90s was looking at what the effect of climate change and human impacts on the national parks. And so I was part of a group that actually worked in Great Smoky Mountains, Noatak, Isle Royale, Rocky Mountain, Olympic. Olympic was the wettest site, and Big Bend National Park was the driest. And we collected basically the same kind of information. And so for almost a decade, we would meet once a year and do the same things and do presentations and talk about, and we coordinated this effort among all the national parks that are part of the Small Reference Watershed. And so my work down at Big Bend has grown out of that, and we still do monitoring and inventory for the park. Now, out of that, as you can see, I'm going to talk about agriculture. I don't have an agricultural background. I don't have any agricultural class. I like to garden, and I like plants, and I taught plant anatomy for a while when I was at the University of Pittsburgh. But I'm a soil ecologist. I work on soils. But what I discovered is I could take what I was learning at Big Bend National Park and translate it up to any natural system and understand what that context is. And so in the same way that drought is important for natural systems like Big Bend National Park, drought has the similar kinds of impact in agricultural systems, but the importance is that those impacts are more succinct in terms of small-scale impacts, as you'll see. So part of what I want to talk about today is how I look at drought. What do I know about drought for agricultural systems in the South Central region? And I'm going to talk about my work that I do out of Texas Tech in cotton, because that's where I work in. I work in the cotton patch. And I work with the USDA and the cotton producers around the region trying to understand climate impacts and how do you make ecological systems and agricultural systems on the Southern High Plains sustainable with drought and with increasing climate variability. And what does that mean? But you have to keep in mind, I'm coming from this from a soils perspective. How do microorganisms deal with drought? How does that linkage go back to what the farmer has to do, and how is that all played out? So that's the context. So I'm going to talk about these aspects. What are some of the current economic consequences of drought? When we talk about drought from a farmer's perspective, it is all about the economy. It's about how to make sure they stay economically viable from year to year. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is drought, because as Dr. Burkett said, the discussions with the South Africans, or the people out of Africa on the IPCC report, we have different viewpoints on what drought is. So when I talk to a cotton producer, he has one aspect of drought. When I talk to a rancher, she has another aspect of drought. When I talk to my colleagues in plant and soil science, they have another consequence. So I'm going to talk to you about what my aspects of drought deal with. I'm going to talk about soils, and as you can see, I indicated soils run the world. Because in terms of how we as a society have to deal with our livelihood, soils play a vital role in all that. I'm going to talk then a little bit about agricultural systems and drought, and then some human activity contributing to drought, but not from a carbon production standpoint. There's going to be some other aspects of drought that are contributed by land use. So everybody, I think, clearly understands the economics of drought agricultural systems. So, as I said, I work in the cotton patch. So these two pictures are the consequence of drought in 2003, where we had some fields. This is taken at the same time. So what did a farmer have to deal with in 2003 versus 2004, which was a wet year? These are the same field plots. These are the same field plots. And so from a production standpoint, you obviously have immediate impacts on crop production. The farmer was not able to harvest any salvageable crop out of 2003. And the consequence of that is then economic loss. Most farmers, if you don't know, are really at the threshold of failure from year to year, at least in the Southern High Plains. They are at the threshold of being successful and not being successful. If you have 1 or 2 or 3 years like this, you're in dire straits. So we can talk about the economic loss. So I'm going to use the 2011 drought as an indication of what are some of the long-term consequences and economic cost of all that. Now before I do that, let me take my watch off so I don't keep talking for a couple hours. So I know where I'm going. So obviously one of the major consequences in the Southern High Plains had to do with cattle, and that was the largest loss in 2011. That was over $2 billion. Corn came in at $327 million. Hay was $750 million. The other big one was cotton loss at $1.8 billion. $243 million for wheat, for a combined total just for the state of Texas of a direct economic loss of $5.2 billion. Now, subsequently, they've gone back and looked at the indirect consequence or the indirect impact of drought, and you can add another $3.5 billion to that total. So just for the state of Texas alone, the 2011 drought economically cost $8.7 billion. A phenomenal cost to the economy of our state. And again, you have to factor into it Oklahoma, New Mexico, and then what went on into the Corn Belt later in 2012. So strictly from a farmer's perspective, the economic consequences are staggering at this level. And the question is, given multiple years that if this occurs, the state economically is not viable under those kinds of conditions. So where are we with the current understanding of drought? Well, I could find some information up to the early part of June, and as you can see, we've had a little bit of change in the drought index for the state of Texas, but we're still at the cusp of failure. And importantly, point number 2, let's see if this will work here. Point number 2 is in West Texas, there are towns in which they have 45 to 90 days of drinkable water left. Even though we've had rains, we still have situations where a large segment of the rural population who farms is in dire straits with drinking water. if you drove into Norman, you came through Wichita Falls. Wichita Falls is under a stage 5 drought condition. They're bringing in water for drinking purposes because that city has run out of water. Lubbock, interestingly enough, Lubbock gets about 40% of its water from a lake southeast of us, so we have to pump water uphill to Lubbock to get water to Lubbock. We get the other part of our water out of fields in eastern New Mexico. Now they built this lake 5 years ago with a time scale of 20 years. The time scale on the lake as of this year is 3. We have 3 years left of usable water out of that lake, which was built for a 20-year cycle. And the reason is drought, because they had not been able to predict or to project what the impact of putting a lake in that location was. So that's the economic perspective, and that is something that everybody doesn't take for granted, but takes from the standpoint that that's a direct cost to the farmer. But what I want to look at is the ecological perspective of what is drought. So first of all, obviously, it's just simply lack of precipitation. But from a soil's perspective, it's also the length of period between rainfall events. And as we know, it's a change in frequency, and it's the increase in air and soil temperatures that then feed back on all these to cause droughts to either be extreme or not to be as bad, simply because of the fact that you haven't had precipitation in a long period of time. The last month in Lubbock, we have had the best soil conditions for farmers probably in the last decade. And the reason is we've gotten not a lot of rain, but air temperatures have not been high. And as a consequence of that, even though we've gotten not as much rain as we should, air temperatures are such that soil temperatures are low, we don't have a lot of evapotranspiration, and the impacts of having lower precipitation has not been as extreme. So we know when you look at the precipitation for Texas and the variability, this is out of the Desert Research Institute, their rainfall projections and calculations. We know where we are going into 2011, 12, and 13 in terms of what that drop in precipitation was across the strait compared to the average. So we're at the lowest. There we go. So the next point is, how are cropping systems impacted by climate and drought? And so the point being, from a farmer's perspective, they not only have to deal with total changes of precipitation, but they also have to deal with particularly these last 3. Soil temperatures, both high and low, heat stress from air temperatures, and wind stress as a consequence of the drought exacerbating and changing the conditions under which they're planting. So what do we know about how soils deal with drought and what I call heat load? Now, this is obviously not an agricultural system. This is one of my sites at Big Bend National Park. If you're familiar with the park, this is the Chisos, which is the core mountain group in the middle of all the park, and I'm down in the what's called the Lowland Desert Scrub. Now, you can see, and the picture's not a false picture, it's brown. And the reason that it is brown is that we've had extensive drought in the park since 2000. And then in the spring of 2011, as conditions dried down even more, in February of that year, air temperature in the park in February at the low elevations along the river went down to 4 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 consecutive nights. So what it did is the plants were already drought stressed, and then they dealt with the freezing temperatures of 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And what it did is it was like a wildfire going through Big Bend. It killed most of the desert vegetation that was not well hydrated for miles. For miles. So what's happening is in most of my plots, I have no live vegetation left. It is all gone. It is not root sprouting. There is nothing coming back. And the question then becomes is as you build up soil temperatures, how are you going to get seedlings back in these situations? So what I'm interested in looking at in Big Bend and also translating to an agricultural system is how do soils store and release heat? How does precipitation impact how soils gain and store heat? And then what happens to soils between rainfall events? Keep in mind that what we're talking about is how the physics of heat storage, heat release, heat capacity of soils interacts with drought and how it either exacerbates drought or doesn't prolong it. And then the last question, obviously, is how is drought influenced by soil heat load? Now, I have two graphs that are from Big Bend National Park. That our Glen Springs site is a low elevation site. This is a mid elevation grassland. But what I want to point out about these is that in all terrestrial ecosystems, there is a heat load profile in which the soils store and gain heat relative to air temperature. So the blue line is maximum air, and the orange line is maximum soil temperature. And these soil temperatures are not at the surface. These are 15 centimeters deep. This is what the temperature is at 15 centimeters. And as you can see, there is a point where that soil temperature line crosses the air temperature max and stays there. Now you can see where you have precipitation events because everything drops. But this characteristic heat load profile occurs for every ecological system. It doesn't matter whether you're working in forests, grasslands, rangelands, coastal prairies, or agricultural systems. Every system stores and loses heat at a certain rate, and I'll show you some interesting data based on vegetation type, precipitation pattern, and how much heat it is, how much exposure. Okay, so we have this kind of condition. Now, what this graph shows is the variability in the air or soil temperature. So this is the difference between max and min. So what I'm calling, what we have started to look at this, we're calling this the daily temperature range. What is the daily temperature range of soils relative to air, and how does that play out with respect to drought? So in this particular case, we see these large fluctuations in air temperature. And what's interesting too, is you get into the summer, they become less, mainly because of the fact that the nighttime temperature is warming up. Right? But you can see, again, this is the variability in soils at 15 centimeters. Now, what you don't know is where is this from? This is Fort Benning, Georgia. This is a loblolly pine plantation where this is occurring. So, and again, and it's because I had some, we were down there working on soil processes for the Army. So that's one response. Oh, I see what happened. Oh, that's too bad. This is one of the conditions of a Mac or a PC to Mac translation. I've lost the other graph. It's unfortunate. So that, I don't know why it would have done that. Okay. Because it was on my PC. Yeah, so that graph is gone, unfortunately. But basically what the other graph was is that I had a system in which had more vegetation cover. And what you found was that the system as a whole was less variable. It was, you had far less change in DTR. Go back here. Okay, so the question then becomes, as you deal with this whole aspect of DTR and soil temperature and precipitation events, obviously the effect of a precipitation event on soil is going to have a major impact on temperature depending upon whether you have a small pulse of rain or a large pulse of rain. Because obviously what's going to keep those soils at a lower temperature is the amount of energy necessary to evaporate that water. The more moisture there's in, the more that soil is buffered in terms of gaining and storing heat. So what are the consequences of that from a soil's perspective? Well, we can look at nitrogen cycling, and this is the amount of nitrate available in this sodal grassland with respect to temperature. So it increases with average monthly temperature, but it also increases in average minimum temperature. So the availability of nitrate is affected by temperature because it's controlling both plant uptake and microbial production. Those are the two components. But what about the actual amount of microbes present? So we can measure what's called microbial biomass. And this is the amount of carbon that's bacterial and fungal. And what you can see is there's no relationship between average monthly or average monthly minimum. There's no relationship. Even though the nitrate is responding, the actual biomass is not showing a response. But what it's responding to is the difference in between max and min, and it's a negative relationship. So the larger the difference, the less microbial biomass there is. Because what happens is that microbes, as they deal with soil temperatures, as a consequence of drought or other factors, have to repair the damage with this amount of variability. And as a consequence, they don't build biomass. They simply do something else with that carbon. So the less variable the daily temperature range, the more biomass you build up in those soils. Now, the other part of this is that we did a watering experiment at Big Bend in which this was a 6-year watering study in which we did some summer water, some winter water, summer, winter, and these diagrams are a whole suite of microbial parameters. But basically what I wanted to point out about that is that depending upon when the season of precipitation you add, you can have an effect or you don't have an effect, and that in some cases, even with above average precipitation, if you added more, you still got an effect, even in an average. But in a dry year, because of changes in soil temperature, it didn't matter when you added water, you could not see an effect, because the effect of the precipitation was overwhelmed by the temperature effect of controlling microorganisms. And so drought, changes in soil temperature, irrespective of moisture, has a negative effect on how that soil functions. Now, if you happen to go to Google Earth and you look around Big Bend National Park, you may come across this pattern if you can catch it. And so the question is, what are these? Well, that's what these are. These are our experimental plots at Big Bend National Park. What we've done is we've shaded the soil surface with greenhouse cloth to reduce maximum temperature and to change DTR. Because the question is, how are you going to change soil temperatures without impacting the plant? And so our first attempt, and this study's been going on since 2006. We simply have a 5 by 5 meter plot. We stretch these shade cloths, and they're set about 15 centimeters above the ground, and we have the vegetation growing through them, except now there's no vegetation left. These other plots, we have respiration chambers that are measuring continuously CO2 emissions from the soil. We had to shade them somewhat differently, but to be able to cover the respiration chamber. So we have these two plots looking at various aspects. And basically, what DTR, or what we do with DTR, is the following. We decrease the maximum temperature, and we increase the minimum temperature at night by a little bit. So that's how we change DTR. Now, you may argue, well, this is artificial. Well, what you may not know is that for the globe, DTR has been changing. In fact, it's becoming less and less at a rate of minus 0.1 degrees centigrade per decade, and that's a published value. So DTR across the planet has been being reduced that much.
What is DTR?
DTR is daily temperature range, right? So the amount of variability in that day. Now, we took the Big Bend data and looked at the Big Bend data since 1940. The arid systems around the planet, including Big Bend, are decreasing DTR at a rate of 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade. So what's happening is we're obviously not changing the max, we're changing the min. So the night times are becoming warmer and warmer, and that variation during the day is becoming shorter and shorter. So the consequence of that is we've measured in our microbial parameters, this is microbial biomass carbon, microbial biomass nitrogen, and what you can see is when you change DTR without any change in soil moisture, you almost get a 30% increase in microbial biomass just by changing the DTR. And that then has implications to how all the system changes. So one of the consequences of global climate change is this shift in DTR and how microbial responses to that shift in DTR, even without changing precipitation. So what happens with drought? As you go into drought, and what happens with DTR? So this is, again, more of our Big Bend study, because it's the longest term data set. So this is DTR for air and soil at the soil surface. And then this is what's going on at 15 centimeters. And then here is where we have not the precipitation, but the air DTR. So this is surface, and this is 15 centimeters. And so we're going from 2010 into our major drought period. And what you can find is that as soils were under normal conditions, now this is under our plots. Under normal conditions, we see a 6-degree change in DTR at the surface when you shade it. But notice what's happening is that over time, as soils are drying, you get no response to DTR at the surface. But what starts to happen is you start to see an effect further down of DTR. So as soils dry out, it changes the heat load profile. So the question then becomes for an agricultural system, what regulates how sustainable cropping systems are? And what we can see is that sustainability is impacted by how soils store and release heat. These affect germination rates and evaporative loss, and microbial responses also play a major role in how agricultural systems should respond to DTR. Now, what I did is we went into the West Texas Mesonet and collected their data for the last decade and looked at how soils across the region, these are a series of agricultural sites that under different soil types and different cropping systems. What we did is we looked at a dry year, an average year, and wet year, and this is the annual mean temperature. What these are is this is the frequency distribution of the average mean temperature. This is the frequency distribution of the average mean temperature, and then these bars show you where that median is of that distribution. And what you can see is depending upon what soil type you were in and what agricultural system, you got various types of distributions for a dry and average wet. But what's interesting about the wet year is they were always bimodal. And that had to do with the effect of moisture coming in at different parts of the year, driving down soil temperatures because there was more moisture. But what about DTR? Well, this is what DTR looks like. And so what's interesting is that depending upon the soil type and location, sometimes DTR is actually less in a dry year, and sometimes it is more in a dry year. And it depended upon what the agricultural system was and what soil conditions were like. So there's no specific response of agricultural systems to DTR. It does depending upon the conditions at the site and what the farmer is growing. So Diane showed you a picture of this the other day in terms of the agricultural systems in Lubbock. So what we did is we took what we knew from Big Bend and we brought them up to Lubbock, and we set these erosion control blankets out in our field, instrumented them up, and then changed DTR to see what the response. Well, one of the most interesting responses is this was the amount of plants that we got in a dryland cropping system, with no supplemental water, just by changing DTR in emergency. And so we got a full normal production of cotton under our DTR plots and almost no production of cotton when we didn't change DTR. We hadn't changed anything else. Soil conditions are all the same. There's no difference in moisture. No difference in moisture. Only daily temperature range was changed. Now, The last component is obviously drought has going to impact how we use water for agriculture. And what I want to show is this graph of what the projections are for water across Texas. And the blue is agriculture, urban areas. And so what this graph is looking at is what are the changes in water use and how is drought going to impact that. And as you can see, for most of the year, for most of Texas, we're going to see the increases in water demand, mainly because of the fact that we have large increases in population, and then these changes in water use based on agricultural perspectives. The question becomes, are we going to have enough precipitation to meet that demand? Well, we know, for example, that if you want to grow cotton in West Texas, irrigation is the way to go. You have far better production than a non-irrigated. But that's under normal cropping system. So what we're trying to figure out is, as drought increases and we move, how do you deal with the drought? And one way that we might deal with it is growing dryland cotton, but changing the DTR. So how is a farmer going to change DTR? What else impacts drought across Texas is the size distribution of these agroecosystems. And so what's happening across most of the state is it's becoming increasingly fragmented up with smaller and smaller parcels of land. And that has both a negative effect on the biodiversity, because you don't have large tracts that are more uniform, but you have a lot of small-scale production going on. Now, you do have some parts of the state where you have large tracts of land. These are all ranches down here, but you can see where the urban areas are, and you can see where some of these numbers of small sites occur. And so this actually represents the percent change across the state of Texas in terms of what these agricultural sites are actually doing. Part of this is in response to the economics, the scale of economics of dealing with drought and where you're at in that threshold of being economically sustainable. In different parts of the state, depending upon the agricultural commodity, are responding in different ways. But this is what the fragmentation of agricultural land in Texas looks like currently. So obviously you can see the large metropolitan areas have the greatest fragmentation. But fragmentation is occurring across the whole part of Texas. So, what are the impacts of drought in agricultural systems? Now, you'll notice that one of the things I have not talked about has to do with both what happens to the type of agroecosystem, soil conditions, and size of holdings. These components do impact how drought develops from the standpoint that soils have to store and release heat, and it's that culmination of heat. Now, one of the things that does happen also in drought, to be aware of, is that the larger the land area is not planted, the greater likelihood you're going to go into drought on a large enough scale because of the heat load dynamics of that system. So non-vegetative areas increase drought development and persistence. That's what flash droughts are about. Where in West Texas, you have a large enough area where it changes the heat load dynamics of the landscape and the atmosphere. But one of the aspects that we do not understand is what happens to soils as they come out of drought over the long term. I cannot tell you that. So as we move in and out of drought, both short and long term, I don't know how well the current systems are for managing agricultural systems in the south central region are going to have to change, or whether a farmer will have to change his practices. We simply don't know. Thank you folks very much.